No spoilers. No.
Soulstice. I was concerned when I saw the trailers on the PlayStation Store page were all pre-rendered because, let's be real, what does a pre-rendered trailer actually tell you about a video game? Art direction, yes, and maybe the general tone the game is aiming for, but it misses out the main thing, what the gameplay actually looks like, what we're going to be spending the next several hours doing, and more to the point, if it looks like something that would appeal to a customer. I always see this as a red flag. I wonder what the game's marketing team just don't want us to see, and more often than not, it completely turns me off of trying games because I just don't know what I'm getting into, and while they might have screenshots, they can be misleading or just completely uninformative. If I show you a screenshot right now, what does that tell you about the game itself? Very little. It's a cool screenshot, it's actually my desktop background at the moment because I think it just looks really neat, but it doesn't tell you anything about what the game is. Maybe it's just me, but if your game is full of high-octane action and entertaining set pieces that are genuinely quite thrilling to be engaged with, then maybe, just maybe, crazy idea here, your trailer should include shots of such, so that a potential buyer has an idea of what they're getting into. I know the mainstream game industry hates us with a passion and is only concerned with squeezing money out of us without giving two shits about our experience, but I do miss the days when they at least pretended to try and care. I have to assume that the trailer maker was just inept as all fuck, because Soulstice is genuinely quite fun with great combat that could easily have filled a trailer. Why hide what the game does well? It's like anti-marketing. Do you want to know why I ended up picking Soulstice up? I rolled a d20 and it was the game I landed on. And if I could at some point remember what I did with a bit of paper that I scrawled the other 19 games onto, I'll let you know what it was up against. Is it perfect? No, of course not, but it's not bad at all, and I feel like the store page just doesn't do it justice, and I've heard no one in my social circles so much as mention it, so we're talking about it here today. I welcome you, my friends, enemies and entities, to another review. Today we're looking at the hack and slash action game Soulstice and examining what it does right, where it falls short, and whether or not it's worth picking up when all is said and done. If you do end up enjoying this, please consider leaving a like or subscribing for more stuff, it's much appreciated. With that said, let's dive on in, starting with... I won't pretend that Soulstice is particularly unique as far as mechanical choices go. It's got very little that I haven't seen in some form or manner somewhere else before, and a few ideas it does have aren't really all that impressive, as they basically boil down to turn on this coloured field to do damage to coloured enemies. The combat itself is third person, heavily combo based, and grades you on your performance after each encounter, all things that we've seen before. To be fair though, a game doesn't have to be super unique to be good. It's okay to just focus on doing the ideas you had as well as you can, and I think that Soulstice mostly gets right what it tries to do, with only one or two stumbles that mostly boil down to I just personally don't love those decisions. First of all, let's talk controls, because I almost always forget to and I want to do better. The left analog stick is for movement, the right one is to adjust the camera. You press the right stick to lock onto enemies in combat, and it's triangle and square for all your various attacks, with the former being your default sword and the latter being assigned to whatever other weapon you have equipped. You switch weapons with the D-pad. In battle, you'll often see enemy attacks coming, and with the simple completion of a QuickTime event by pressing O, you can freeze the enemy in place, giving you a chance to hit and run. For all things jumping, it's the cross button. You can dash to evade enemies with L1, access your inventory for your healing items with R1, and by pressing L2 and R2 at the same time, you enter the game's range mode, where you basically just get better at killing for a few seconds before ending in a finishing move that damages everyone in the same hemisphere. The controls are responsive. I've never had a single moment playing the game where I pressed a button and found any noticeable delay, which is worth a high five, because that's an issue I've noticed a few too many times in recent years, even from some higher profile projects. Looking at you, Elden Ring, I already suck, you know, you don't need to be a dick about it. Next up, let's talk visuals. The game looks really rather good. The graphics are high quality, and the game has a strong anime-inspired art style. At least that's what I think it's going for. Whatever it is, it makes my brain do the happy chemicals because, as I so often point out, a strong distinctive artistic style is far more important than just having shiny graphics. Sure, photorealistic games can look pretty, but hold up an impractically sized anime sword to my neck and ask me to name any specific details about games that go that route, and you might as well cut my head off and have your way with the next stump because it's a lost cause. Whilst I can clearly remember all the little details in games like The Outer Worlds or Firewatch or Stardew Valley, because art style is just that much more important than pure graphical quality. I know I bring that up a lot, it's just really important to me, and I am autistic as all fuck, so I love weirdly specific repetitions of points. I'm weird, I'm aware. Now, a fair question to ask is, how does the combat feel? As you might know, this is something else I take rather seriously, and for me it's a major concern when playing any game with a combat system. It's not enough to just swing a sword and watch the enemy take damage, of course though, that is a must. I need to feel something. The crunch, the slash, I need to see enemies flinching or being knocked around. If my attack fails, I need to feel that failure. I need that ploink when my sword helplessly deflects off a shield, or even to see my character stumble a little bit. I need to feel like what I'm doing has, for lack of a better word, impact. To illustrate what I mean, and I'm probably in the minority here, but one of my favourite things about using a halberd in Dark Souls 1 is that if you miss an attack, you'll stumble awkwardly, so you're encouraged to be accurate or risk leaving yourself more open than your mum's legs when a postal worker enters the room. Don't worry, in this scenario she isn't cheating, your dad is watching from outside the window dressed as a 1950s deep-sea diver as he rubs his groin with a carrot cake. Hey, don't ask me why, they're your parents, you weirdo. There's a few methods for achieving that all-important feel, like say controller vibration or screen shaking by having enemies flinch in response to what direction they're being hit from, or through just having excellent sound design making the mere act of swinging the sword through air and foe alike a delight, not to mention the specific animations your character performs when attacking. I find the best combat systems will include 2 or more of any of these. Soulstice includes 3 of these. Well done, Soulstice, beating out the bare minimum earns you the bronze trophy. Just be careful, I'm pretty sure it was in the viewer's parents' bedroom during that whole sex thing and I'm not entirely sure what they did to it. No, I don't know why it smells like cheese, please don't ask. The attack animations of weapons are quite exaggerated in a way that makes them look weighty enough, but each move, even with the heavier weapons, is pulled off just swift enough that the actual flow of combat doesn't take a hit. Meanwhile, the weapons make exaggerated combat sounds as they cut through the air and connect with enemies without it being too much, and it makes the fights fun. It's a hard balance to achieve, so hats off, the devs got these 2 things very right. Your default sword is swift and efficient, with it also being able to flow in and out of combos with other weapons. Something really cool is that your sword is both a great sword and a warhammer, being able to switch between the 2 on command. The sword is faster and better at crowd control, but the hammer hits harder and is quite a good counter for enemies in armour. Plus, it can also stagger enemies more effectively, making them easy to put down. There are a total of 7 weapons available for you to fight with. One of them is a glove that, like the hammer, is a handy anti-armour tool, at least it would have been if I hadn't discovered it too late. And it wasn't through any fault of my own, you start with the hammer as your first backup weapon, and it already does more armour damage than the glove does. It can also still hit multiple targets with every attack, whereas the glove kinda struggles. Basically, the moment you pick up the glove, it's rendered immediately ineffective. You have a bow, but there's no manual aim option, so you have to rely on the lock-on, and the problem is the lock-on just doesn't always work properly with this weapon. Sometimes if you move in a direction whilst locked on, you'll fire in that direction. It wouldn't be so bad, but the bow's damage is pitiful, and by the way, you could already double jump and get right up close to flying enemies, so I don't know why you'd even need this thing. It very quickly became a weapon that I only used by accident. On to more fun weapons, there's a whip. It does less damage than a sword or hammer, but it has a much longer reach than either of them, plus it also can hit more frequently. Also, it has the best attack animations in the game. They are a delight to watch. I always love it when I play a video game and a character who equips a whip basically does a dance with it. It just makes me smile. There's a special pair of daggers, which I used the grand total of 3 times, then forgot they existed because there was never a situation where they were the best choice. They have piss poor range and damage, and just why would you even bother? And finally, we have the exploding fists. I never intentionally used these. They're really not that good. Sure, their combos can end in a blast sometimes, but that blast is highly ineffective, and besides, by the time I got this weapon, I'd already been investing into my sword, hammer and whip, and didn't really want to get used to a new tool that I just didn't need. So most of the weapons are forgettable. Of course you can upgrade them. The game gives you access to a store and a character improvement screen between every chapter, and sometimes within a chapter when you find this latent bloke, and there are some interesting enough attacks for you to unlock if you're willing to invest the currency, but to be real with you, once I got the sword, whip and hammer to where I wanted them to be, I saved the rest of my money for healing crystals. There are some cool ideas as far as the weapons go, but when I'm surrounded by ghosts, demons and armoured lunatics, I'm going to stick with the Magnificent Three, because they're the best options for basically every combat encounter, and every other weapon can sit on the bench where they belong. Oh right, the third thing the game's combat does really well. Some enemies get knocked around easily by attacks. Not all, some of them you have to weaken by damaging their poise, but once it's busted, juggling them with attacks is endlessly fun. That almost slipped my mind. Alongside the combat, the game dabbles in platforming, which serves to separate the combat rooms from one another, but the big issue here is that the game just isn't very good at platforming bits. The first problem is scale. Our character is tiny on screen most of the time, and the camera's tendency to break the 180 rule and jump around to the next most cinematic angle without a care in the world was jarring. It can be really hard to gauge distance, and with the camera being a dramatic ponce, you can easily find yourself backtracking because the new angle makes it look like the way you just came from was in fact the way forward. It's awkward and unruly, but I find the bigger issue is that there really aren't any stakes in these platforming segments. If you fall, you won't ever take damage, so you're not incentivized to develop a skill, since the punishment for failure is do it again but properly this time. And worst of all, whilst in battle the character controls with a good sense of flow, she absolutely does not during this downtime. There's an awkward stiffness to her jumps and movements when platforming, platforming, but what really drags it down for me is how the game attempts to repurpose tools for combat into tools for traversal, which I would usually quite like, but here I find it takes shape in the way that makes the experience feel too video gamey. And yep, I ain't retiring that phrase anytime soon. You might have noticed that there's a ghost with us and that she can project 2 fields to aid us both in and out of combat sections. I hope you noticed, there's going to be a test later. In battle it's simple enough. The blue field lets you damage blue enemies and the red field lets you damage red enemies, and whilst out of battle the fields let you shatter crystals of the same colour, the blue one also serves to cause these crystal platforms to become corporeal so you can traverse them, whilst the red one is exclusively for breaking red things. These fields don't last long, and if you don't turn them off then it will cause your ghost gal to overload and you have to wait a whole 3 seconds before trying again. Wait, that's it? Not really very good at punishments, are you, Soulstice? You might think that the overload would make the fields recharge more slowly in, say, combat, but no, the fields return no less swiftly, and thanks to the upgrade trees, you can even make it so that when you do overload, you cause damage to all the enemies in the nearby area, which is a great idea. Turning a weakness into a strength is awesome, but before that, the overload was never a concern for me. Outside of battle, all an overload means is that you have to wait a few extra seconds before trying again. Please understand that I don't mind these downtime moments because you kind of need them to make the more action-heavy moments in the game feel the more impactful. If it was all action all the time, it would be less special and probably begin to grate until I eventually got bored and went back to see if your parents and the postal worker were still going at it. It's just that Soulstice didn't really fill this time with anything good. We got janky, unpleasant platforming sections built in a game that really wasn't designed properly to handle them, and honestly, in my first draft of this script, I forgot entirely about them and wondered what the hell I was doing between all the fights until reviewing the footage. Then I was like, oh yeah, crappy platforming. I guess it's not necessarily a bad thing that the downtime was so forgettable, because the fighting is after all while we're playing the game, and to be fair, there are some puzzles, like shattering crystals in a time limit to access a path, or actually that's the only puzzle the game really has, but it does try to spice things up, as later on you'll find these spiky balls and traps that react to your fields. The blue ones burst unless the blue field is active, and the red ones burst if the red field is active for too long, so you do have to take them into consideration, but I doubt you'll ever seriously struggle with them. I think I took damage from maybe 2 because I just wasn't paying that much attention. Still, I suppose between having puzzles and not having puzzles, I'd rather have some puzzles. It's not a big problem. What is a big problem, at least to me anyway, is just how addicted the game is to invisible walls. If you know me, you know how irritating I find invisible walls since they're a complete design cop-out, and trust me, Soulstice is definitely not doing anything to improve that image. You can sort of explore your environments and find secrets and upgrades, but you better believe that despite so many areas looking traversable, you're actually going to be on an incredibly tight, specific path. Linearity isn't bad by any means. Some of my favourite games are entirely linear, but they have the decency to not bog themselves down with unnecessary invisible barriers because the design team were more competent than that. Some of the invisible walls in Soulstice are just bizarre, like this one in the sewer here, where you see this alcove just can't be accessed. There's no good reason for there to be an invisible wall there. Sure, I don't really need to access it, I'm supposed to just run right past it, but the fact that I keep running up against an equally unnecessary barrier means my immersion takes a bit of a hit. Or take these reoccurring stairs that you find around the city that you need to use. You can't jump up or down over the side to quickly progress unless you're right by the bottom, and even then, it might just not let you anyway out of spite. So despite our character being able to jump higher than a coked up kangaroo that just caught sight of your dad watching the postal worker bonking session, we still have to walk up and down the stairs like a good little girl. Jarring is a good word to describe the feel of playing the game when you're not in combat, because whilst the combat is great and flows like a particularly aggressive river, every moment in between is just kind of awkward to get through. Doing battle with a room full of enemies, nailing the quick time events to freeze them in place and deflect the projectiles as I swap from sword to hammer to whip all in a space of like 3 seconds as I move closer and closer to the edge of my sofa is amazing and it feels great, but then the game hits the brakes hard and now I need to navigate samey looking environments with a camera operator who seems to have ADHD. It doesn't help when the areas we need to traverse are so repetitive. The sewer level is easily the worst of them. I was stuck in there for like half an hour trying to figure out what path I hadn't taken yet because the interiors and exteriors all look so damn samey. Now, before anyone decides to be a Weisenheimer, yes, the whole game takes place in one fantasy religious city, and as such, it only makes sense that the city's architecture remains relatively consistent, and I will offer credit. There is a lot of detail in the environments that initially makes them a joy to behold, but by hour 10 of identical streets and rooms, I was starting to drift off. Yeah, it's safe to say you won't come or stay for the platforming. Nope, you'll be here for the battles, and what fun battles they are. Even the ones that annoyed me a little bit through gimmicks that I wasn't expecting didn't break my spirit. I almost always felt like I could go for one more round. My advice if you want to play the game for yourself would be to remember that aggression is key. Taking too long to act is often what led to my deaths. By all means be aware of your situation and what the other enemies are doing, but don't be passive. That's not really how the game is won. There's not even a block skill, so your only option is to be on the offensive. You can dodge if you need to, but if you dodge 3 times in a row, the final dodge ends with you slowing down down a bit, so be smart about it. You have your ghost counters for a reason, be sure to make use of them, but do be wary when using them because they'll increase the entropy, which is the meter that governs how close your fields are to overloading. Luckily, attacking enemies of the same hue as your current active fields halts the build-up, and if you defeat them, it can even reduce it. And if that's not proof that the game wants you to be on the offensive as much as physically possible, then I don't know what is. And honestly, I love it. Being hyper-aggressive isn't usually how I play games, so it's fun to step out of that comfort zone and embrace the madness. In combat, you'll also probably notice the two portraits in the top right corner that seem to feel like gauges every time you land hits. This signifies the level of harmony between your human, who I think I should probably mention at some point is named Briar, and the little ghost girl Lute. If you have a lot of harmony, it basically means that you can fight better. Lute becomes a more potent support unit through damaging and countering enemy blows, and provided you've unlocked them, Briar can perform these special resonance attacks with her weapons that clear rooms more effectively. Also, once you hit a certain level of harmony, you can enter the rapture state, the thing I referred to as the rage state earlier on because I forgot what the word used was. Whilst being in such a state limits you to only sword attacks, it does allow you to damage all enemies without concern for your fields. It also makes you a bit faster and stronger, and then lets you end with a powerful finishing move that can basically nuke the battlefield under the right conditions. What I think is quite cool is that your finisher is based on the upgrades you've been getting for loot throughout your journey, with a total of 4 finishing moves being available. Before we do get onto the upgrades though, I think it's only fair to warn you that the rapture state is dangerous. If you use it too often, Briar runs the risk of losing her sanity and going berserk. If this does happen, you have to complete a series of QTEs in order to calm her the fuck back down, but if you don't, it's game over. I had this happen to me 3 times throughout the entire game. Once at the moment when the game wanted to introduce the mechanic where I passed with flying colours, yippee, and twice more towards the end of the game where despite my best efforts I just can't seem to pass the conditions. I don't get it. Both times it occurred I did exactly what the game asked me to do, but it was having none of it. That was a sour note to end on. I haven't been back to the game yet because I feel like it was arbitrarily dicking me out of the progress. And yeah, I could just not use the rapture state, but I shouldn't be deterred from using a mechanic because the game is a spiteful cunt about it. Risk-reward gameplay is fine, but only when the mechanics behave consistently to the point where the failure lies with the player's own error. What happened here wasn't the case, and I don't even know what I could do better because I don't know what I did wrong. I was doing exactly what the game asked me to do, but it wasn't good enough, so I quit the game in frustration. As you fight your way through the game, you'll gather blue and red crystals. The red ones are for Briar. They allow her to unlock new weapon skills, increase weapon proficiency, and also serves as a currency for buying healing items. Every enemy drops red crystals when defeated, and you can also smash quite a lot of them out of the regular... That's exactly how you say regular objects in the game world. I'm very good. Loot's upgrades are paid for using the blue crystals and are considerably vaster. You can modify her offensive and defensive capabilities, plus grant buffs to her fields and their capacities. It's not overly difficult to get to a position where you can afford most of her upgrades. By the end of the game, I'd bought every single available upgrade. The rest were locked away behind something. I actually don't know why, but it hardly matters. By the end of the game, Loot was already a powerhouse. She wasn't just defending me, but also killing enemies herself with bolts of spirit energy like the little badass she always knew she could be. So you shouldn't ignore these trees, they're useful to you, and I admit, I always like seeing the whole sweet innocent character turns into a badass thing. Does that trope have a name? Whatever it is, that's what I like. As a whole, the gameplay averages out to being quite good. The feel of the combat, the visceral way enemies burst and fall apart as you defeat them, the need to manage your field so you can damage certain enemies, and how you can turn even a negative, like say Loot's fields overloading due to overuse, into a positive through upgrades. It's all great and I love engaging in it. They make for a fun combat experience, and I was always looking forward to the next room full of baddies because it would mean I'd get to engage with the combat even more. A thing I forgot to mention until now is that most areas have these optional challenge rooms you can enter to earn rare items, like ones that boost your maximum HP, and they can be kind of fun. Others, less so. I like that they're there even if I quickly stopped bothering to do them. And honestly, I didn't feel too debilitated by this. The game is built and paced well enough that even with minimal upgrades you can get quite far. I played about half the game on the night difficulty, which I think is the medium difficulty. Then, out of curiosity, I bumped it down to see what would change, and it's the lazy hacks method to challenge buffing. You just do less damage and take more on higher difficulties. No repositioning enemies, no alterations to their AI or behaviour that I can tell, just make me hit harder / softer depending on the difficulty, and by the Titan I'm so sick of it being done that way. I brought this up in my Darksiders review, but all this approach to difficulty does is make killing the same enemies take longer, and that doesn't add fun in my experience, rather it risks making the game an absolute slog and souring my enjoyment. Fighting for your life only ever being a few hits from destruction with the odds stacked against you is thrilling and intense and and I love it, but a fight isn't made better just by being longer. That causes the initial thrill and excitement to trickle away, and more to the point, I have shit to do. I ain't spending 10 minutes on a boss fight because the hard mode bloats its health pool to a ludicrous extent. Not when I've got a week's worth of dishes to wash and 2 other in-progress video projects. Soulstice, gameplay-wise, is quite good when it plays to its strengths, which it mostly does. There are some areas where it definitely could have used work, like maybe smoothing out the platforming or taking whoever was responsible for the invisible wall outbreak down to the river before telling them about the rabbits one more time, but as the game is mostly combat, it's hard to stay salty because it does combat quite well. Something else I'd like to praise are the game's accessibility options. A colorblind mode is always welcome, but I really love it when a game lets you change the font and size of your text because I really struggle to read and this sort of thing helps me a lot. You can also set the game to autocomplete QTEs or set it up so that when you open your inventory menu it pauses the game, and I love to see it. The more accessibility tools a game has, the wider its audience potential, and that makes me a very happy bunny. To wrap this section up, the game does have a few issues that I feel could use addressing, but as it is now, it's a pretty good action game that I had a lot of fun playing. Now it is by the decree of the three that we discuss the narrative, to which I'm a lot more indifferent to. Ah crap, I gave away my opinion too soon. We open with an interesting enough creation story. Soulstice takes place in a medieval fantasy world with a primary religion based around the three keepers, the torchbearer, the shaper and the judge, who, in ancient times, did battle with corruption and banished chaos from the world, thus establishing a new order. However, the chaos would eventually return, and thus was born the need for those who could fight it. I admit I'm paraphrasing a bit there. The intro is a tad long and it's delivered by the character Lute, whose voice actor isn't terrible, but definitely couldn't avoid sounding a bit awkward most of the time. I don't know, as usual, if this is the fault of said voice actor or if they were just poorly directed. Either way, the result is that the voice acting overall in the game is just kind of alright. It never really rises above passable.
We didn't exactly volunteer for this mission, you know.
As I said, I know who you are, what you are, Briar.
The Shaper had no hand in your creation.
Why did you taunt us?
Also, this entire myth is told with us looking over these stained glass windows, and if like me you're on the spectrum and struggle to pay attention to things, it might just go in one ear and out some other hole. We play as Briar, a knight whose sole duty is to do battle with those possessed by the chaotic forces and rid the world of their influence. To complete such a task, Briar has been turned into something called a chimera, which binds a departed soul to her that allows her to interact with and slay the possessed creatures and malevolent spirits causing harm to the place. This soul is that of her kid sister Lute. The two are deployed to the city of Ilden to deal with a giant sky anus that bears down upon it. Sorry, it's called a tear. I started calling it a sky anus when I first saw it, and now I can't stop. The giant space butt is reducing the entire kingdom to ruin and has completely corrupted everyone who called it home, so all we can do is try and stop those cheeks from spreading any wider. So the goal is simple enough: get to the tear and find a way to close it whilst killing any and all corrupted we meet along the way because they can no longer be saved. I say simple, I haven't the foggiest idea how they'll actually plug this giant sky anus, but I'm guessing it has something to do with the magical purple crystal that's embedded in all chimera. Yeah, that sounds like a problem for future us. Along the way we meet Leighton, our observer, who we report to and who keeps tabs on us. We also learn that we're the third chimera to be deployed to the city and that reinforcements are apparently on the way, but given how dodgy Mask Boy immediately seems, I'd wager that he was bullshitting us at least 50% of the time. Throughout the game, we'll occasionally enter these memory voids where we can learn more about Lute and Briar. Not long ago, they were just two lonely peasants, but Briar became corrupted during a possessed raid on her village. Usually, this would be a death sentence, but Briar, through sheer force of will, managed to fight it off somewhat and still recognised Lute even when losing her mind. Both of these made her a prime candidate for becoming a chimera. We also find these memories that Lute can reveal to us to tell the story of what actually happened to the city and why the Sky Anus opened in the first place. It goes a little something like this. An organisation brought something powerful into town and it broke free. The chimeras that came before us gave chase but were ultimately defeated and transcended. So not only do we have to close a freshly opened sky butt, we also have to contend with two of our own who have been made into powerful monsters. Transcension is a threat to the chimera, you see. It's basically what happens when they lose control and their corruption takes over, and it tends to lead to horrific mutations, and once this line is crossed, there is no going back. The atmosphere of the story is serious and depressing. Lute and Briar are suggested to be detested creatures and are tackling a threat that they feel woefully underprepared for. There are apparently reinforcements on the way to help us, but the Sky Anus is getting wider and wider, and we need to close it sooner rather than later, meaning we can't wait around for backup. As is probably to be expected, Briar isn't exactly cheery about things. She's a rookie, still all banged up from the raid that took her village and her parents. Her little sister is scared and mentally not ready to face the horrors that she's set to witness, both from the world at large and from her own sister, as Briar grapples with the beast within that constantly needs to be controlled lest she lose herself. Briar is pretty much angry all the time, and I can't really blame her. She didn't ask to be be this way. This was the choice made for her by questionable authorities. Her little sister and her parents are both dead, but loot is bound to her, meaning that Briar has to take her into battle and risk her soul. It's a harsh existence, and I do feel for the pair. They're basically a disposable tool to be used and discarded as the church sees fit, and it's a real shame because I love bleak narratives, but the voice acting just really doesn't do the story justice. Credit where it's due, Briar's voice actor can nail an irritated tone. She constantly sounds like someone working in retail who's just had to deal with 9 of the dumbest people acting like buying their weekly grocery shop is somehow the biggest situation in their lives, and who blame her for the eggs being in a different aisle to what they expected, but it's not my fault you didn't read the fucking sign, Robert. Sorry, I blacked out a little bit there, what's going on? Basically what I'm saying is that the actor for Briar did the role perfectly fine. Also a bit off topic, but I really like Briar's design. I love her eye patch and her scars and her armour and the big stupid sword, and when she goes full crazy mode her mouth widens with these sharp teeth, which I just think looks really boss. She's great, I love her. Back to the voice work though, the rest of the acting in the game is just okay. Loot, I already said, sounds a bit awkward in most of her deliveries. Layton was alright, the big sword boy Donovan that you meet later was also just kinda fine. The Transcended Chimera were entertaining enough, kinda hammy, but on reflection I think that makes them more entertaining, but then again, it's not like any of the actors were working with the best material. The dialogue isn't amazing, it can feel very inelegant as some lines just don't flow into each other very well, and other times it's just clunky exposition delivered in the most anime way possible. I've been watching a lot of anime lately and I've noticed that the exposition scenes often have a few lines that just don't feel like things a real person would say in that situation. Like for example, one guy, one of the 2 Chimera that came before us, is constantly reminding us that his shade, that's what the ghosts like Loot are referred to as in-game by the way, is named Jared and is also his brother, like without any prompting and way more often than necessary. I think the main complaint I could levy against the writing though is that it feels a bit amateur at times. There are some interesting points. Loot and Briar's relationship isn't poorly presented and you can tell the 2 care for one another quite a lot, and there's a good sense of hopelessness that hangs over the whole experience that we chip away at more and more as we discover the truth about our past and the motivations of our masters. It might not be the best, but the story wasn't bad and neither were the characters we got to meet. Don't mistake, when I saw Sir Donovan the Shadeless, my immediate thought was, I bet later on we actually meet the Shade and fight with it. And lo and behold, I was right. Look, calling one of you guys whose entire thing is being bound to a shade shadeless is just giving the game away. But I like Donovan as a character. He clearly cares for the girls and feels responsible for them and sort of blames himself for our circumstances, but not because he made us a Chimera himself, it's more that his mercy led to it and it weighs on him heavily, but I won't spoil too much more here. Even Layton has a bit more going on than you might expect. He's initially kind of hostile towards us and our Shade Loot especially, but he does sort of warm up to us over time, and even his initial disdain of Loot addressing him directly seems to wear off after the first couple of encounters. The characters in the story aren't bad. There are a few things holding them back, like how the game's tone rarely shifts from being serious and depressing. The best it can usually change to is being serious and tense when the bosses are encountered, and that's about it. As you know, a good story will shift the tone as it goes along to keep itself fresh and to prevent the audience from experiencing apathy, so it's a bit of a shame that Soulstice doesn't really do this, but when all is said and done, the story of 2 sisters desperately fighting for their lives in the sake of the very world itself against ghosts and demons isn't bad at all. I'll go one step further, it's actually sort of good, but it's held back from being anything higher than that. So yeah, decent plot that could have used some work. I never hated it, actually fairly enjoyed it quite a lot of the time, but I found that long-term investment was a bit challenging as the overall atmosphere remained consistent, almost to its own detriment. If you haven't checked out Soulstice already, then I'd say it's definitely well worth a look. The combat is fun and offers enough delightful spectacle to be a treat for the eyes. The soundtrack is an absolute bop. I never mentioned that at any point throughout this review, and I really wish I did because it's really good. I was constantly humming and head bopping to the sounds of the combat music, and it does exactly what it needs to do, provides a good theme for the fight without drawing too much attention away from what you're doing. The story has some neat ideas and themes and a couple of good reveals. I could see folks not really liking Briar for being an eternal misery gut, but then again I had that same worry when I first played the God of War series about Kratos, the modern God of War series, not the old ones. I can't be bothered to play the old ones, and I have to admit, I didn't dislike Briar myself. The same with Kratos, I actually quite like them both. I think they'd be fun to see in a fight together. She cares about her sister and has a fuck everything attitude that I have a weird fascination for. Hell, I loved Rosa from Brooklyn Nine-Nine for the same reason, and like Rosa, Briar does care for things and isn't just fuck everything all the time. Sometimes she even lets her guard down like a real person would. So it's got some good characters, a decent plot, fun gameplay, a nice art style, and a lovely soundtrack. There's quite a lot going for this game, I feel, and I mostly really enjoyed my time with it. Yeah, the ending QTE thing still has me kinda salty, but I feel I had enough fun with the overall experience to recommend it regardless, with maybe a warning of don't go into the rapture state too much over the top to avoid my own fate. With all that said and done though, that brings us to the end. I do hope you've enjoyed this review. If you have any notes for me, feel free to leave them in a comment, as I do want to improve my videos and make them betterer. Would you believe me if I told you I failed English? Or if you just have a suggestion for games you want me to look into, feel free to leave those as well. Until we meet again, my loves, take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in another video. Oh, and tell your dad he can keep the fucking diving suit.